This move immediately claims central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, preparing for rapid development and controlling key squares. This move, 1, circa 5, initiates the Sicilian defense, a highly combative and complex opening that immediately aims to unbalance the position and create dynamic play for black by challenging white's central pawn on e4 with a flank pawn. This move initiates the popular Sicilian defense, where white aims to control the center and develop pieces rapidly, while black creates an asymmetrical pawn structure that promises dynamic counterplay. This move initiates the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to control the center and prepare for a flexible pawn structure that can lead to dynamic play. This move initiates the open Sicilian, immediately challenging black's central control and leading to dynamic, unbalanced play where tactical opportunities will be plentiful. This move initiates the open Sicilian, a mainline defense where black immediately challenges white's central pawn majority, aiming for an unbalanced game with active piece play. This move establishes white's central pawn presence and prepares for rapid development, common in the open Sicilian as it opens lines for white's pieces. This move, 4, nf6, is a key developing move in the Sicilian defense, directly challenging white's central pawn majority and preparing to castle. This move, nc3, is a standard continuation in many Sicilian defense variations, reinforcing the central pawn on d4 and preparing for further development of the queenside pieces. This move, the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, is a popular and strategically sound choice, immediately aiming to control the b5 square and prepare for queenside pawn expansion. This move, developing the bishop to e2, prepares for kingside castling and supports the central pawn structure, a common approach in many Sicilian defense variations like the classical or Najdorf, aiming for solid development. This move immediately challenges white's central knight and aims to gain space on the queenside, creating a pawn structure typical of the classical Sicilian defense. This move strategically repositions the knight from the active central square to a more flexible outpost on b3, maintaining pressure on black's queenside while avoiding potential tactical complications after black's advancing e5 pawn. Developing the bishop to e7 is a standard move in this variation of the Sicilian defense, preparing to castle kingside and connecting the rooks while reinforcing the central pawn structure. This move, b3, prepares to castle kingside and supports the d4 pawn while potentially developing the queen's bishop to a more active square later in the game. This move initiates king safety by castling into a well-established position, preparing to connect the rooks and bring them into active play. This move solidifies the central pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn breaks like g4, preventing black's nc6 and reinforcing the d4 pawn. This move consolidates black's central pawn structure and prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active square, potentially targeting white's kingside. This move prepares to connect the rooks and supports a potential queenside expansion with b4. Black initiates queenside expansion, aiming to challenge white's control of the center and create counterplay by gaining space and potentially opening lines for the queenside pieces. This move prepares to contest the central d-file, supporting a potential pawn advance or further piece mobilization while also freeing the c1 square. For the remaining bishop, this move develops the knight to a more active square, preparing to support the d5 pawn push and potentially redeploying to c5 or b6 to pressure white's queenside. This aggressive pawn push on g4 aims to gain queenside space and potentially disrupt black's defensive setup by creating attacking opportunities on the kingside. White's aggressive g4 push has opened lines on the kingside, so black's rc8 prepares to contest the open c-file and potentially launch counterplay on the queenside, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed white queen. This aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially open lines for white's attacking pieces. This move re-centers the knight to a more central square, preparing for potential pawn pushes on the queenside or to support the pawn break d5. White continues the kingside pawn advance, aiming to gain space and potentially open lines against black's castled king, while black's knight on b6 is ideally placed to support the central advance of the d-pawn. The knight retreats to h5 to avoid being immediately exchanged and to potentially reposition to g7 or f4, while also preventing white from easily reinforcing their pawn thrust on the kingside. This move prepares to activate the king along the second rank, potentially supporting central play or a kingside pawn push while clearing the f1 square for piece development or rook repositioning. This move initiates a pawn break on the kingside, aiming to create counterplay by opening lines against white's king and challenging the advanced g5 pawn. The king retreats to a safer square, allowing the rook on d1 to become more active while preparing to defend the queenside against black's aggressive pawn advances. This pawn capture opens the f-file for white's rook and frees the black knight to potentially reposition to c4 or a4, offering dynamic counterplay in this Sicilian Najdorf variation. This exchange aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces, particularly the rook on d1, by removing a key defender of the d6 pawn. With the capture of the bishop, white has conceded the bishop pair, but black must now decide whether to maintain this advantage or improve their piece coordination and king safety. This move strategically challenges black's queen, aiming to disrupt their coordination and potentially win material by exploiting the undefended b6 pawn after the queen retreats. This move, exf3+, initiates a critical tactical sequence, forcing the white king to a more exposed square and offering a chance to break white's pawn chain on the kingside. This capture on f3 is a crucial positional exchange, as it removes white's well-placed bishop and opens the f-file for black's rook, while also creating potential weaknesses around white's king. This move resolves the tension in the center and opens up the d-file for your opponent's rook, but it allows white to develop their bishop to a more active square and potentially gain control of the open d-file. This exchange clarifies the pawn structure and opens lines, presenting an opportunity for white to exploit the now exposed dark squares around black's king. This move vacates the g8 square for the king, preparing to potentially reroute it to a safer position on the queenside if white's kingside attack continues to develop. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it controls the crucial c2h7 diagonal and supports potential pawn pushes on the kingside. This move ignites the center and challenges white's bishop, aiming to break open lines and exploit the weakened central pawn structure black has helped create. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, supporting the center and preparing to challenge black's central control after black's last pawn push. This move is a forceful tactical sequence that exploits the pinned knight on d5 and simultaneously attacks the white king, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain initiative. This move repositions the king to a safer square, avoiding the immediate threat of the knight on f4 and allowing the bishop to protect the kingside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal and defends against potential kingside threats while preparing for further central or queenside play. This move repositions the rook to the open f-file, aiming to exert pressure on the opponent's kingside and potentially support a kingside pawn push or coordinate with other pieces for an attack. This move aims to disrupt white's central control and create a passed pawn on the d-file by challenging the strong d5 knight and opening lines for black's pieces. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, potentially supporting an attack on the kingside and reinforcing the d5 pawn. This move introduces a dangerous passed pawn on e3, challenging white's piece coordination and potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces.